Five-time world champion Viswanathan Anand returned to over-the-board chess today after more than 1.5 years, and he played this game in Grand Chess Tour. This was the first round, and Anand was white, Van Forest Jordan was black. The time control is 25 plus 10. This is a position from the game. It is black to move. Pause here and see what you would do as black. Okay, I'm going to reveal the answer during the coverage. Let's begin. White played e4, c5, knight f3, e6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight c6, knight c3, queen c7, and now we enter the Taimanov territory. In this position, there are different ways for white to play. One is g3, there's also bishop e2, there is bishop e3, there's also queen d3, sometimes players are also playing a3, but here Vishy Anand chose pawn to g4. This has also been employed by Artemiev, Magnus Carlsen, and here after a6, bishop e3, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, b5, 000, bishop b7. A nice moment for all of you to think what you would do as white. Now when I looked at this position, I thought maybe we can play something like bishop g2. I have played Taimanov myself with the black side, but I haven't faced this particular variation. Now if white plays something like bishop g2, black can play rook c8 and already threaten b4, and you can see that the knight cannot be moved as queen takes c2 is hanging. Considering this, in this position, after bishop b7, white has to take some precaution. So here white played king b1. Now the reason why Vishy sir chose king b1 is because he wants to play bishop to f4. And now after queen takes f4, he has queen takes d7 ideas. But in this position it's not possible because queen takes f4 is a check. That's the reason he tucks the king away to b1, and now he's actually threatening bishop to f4. Let's say you make a null move like h6 and white is already having ideas of playing bishop f4. So in this position, this is one of the ideas. It's not the only idea, but king b1 is a multi-purpose move. It's also creating space for the king. There is no mate on c2, and there are different ideas. After king b1, Van Forest Jordan played knight to f6, and since this is hanging, Vishy sir played pawn to f3, and then after rook to c8, now you can see the threat. Black wants to play b4 and capture this pawn with a check, and so Anand played pawn to g5 first, attacking the knight. Note that you can't really play b4 as there is g takes f6 and the queen is keeping an eye on g7, so that's not really possible. So after g5, black plays knight to h5. Now this knight continues to be in a lot of danger throughout the game. After knight h5, now again b4 is threatened. In order to deal with this, white has to protect c2. White could consider supporting it with rook d2, but that somehow puts this queen in an awkward position, and black has bishop c5. And then if queen takes c5, then we are entering an endgame with no real advantage to white. And if queen d3, then black can simply castle. So considering this, after knight h5, Anand played queen to d2. Because now after b4, the knight can move and then the pawn on c2 is protected. After bishop e7, he played bishop h3. Again, this move is played with the idea to go with bishop g4. After b4, he simply puts the knight to e2, and then after d5, he plays bishop to g4. Now this knight has nowhere to go, so it has to be supported by a pawn. So Jordan played g6, and then after bishop d4, he's asking another question to the rook on h8. And moving the rook here would make no sense because then black would lose the right to castle. So here he castled, and this is a moment in which Anand takes a very strategic decision. He plays pawn to e5 and closes the center. Now when you're closing the center, that means there is some committal decision here. So white is very confident that he can crash on the king side, and that's why he's closing the center. And there are moves like h4. The immediate threat is bishop takes h5 and knight g3, and so black played knight to g7, and here h4 happened, and after a5 he went h5, and after bishop a6, the knight is the bishop is in contact with the knight, so it makes sense to move that knight away, also making space for the queen to go to h2. So the move knight g3 is obvious, and after a4 he goes f4, and then after b3, there's a very interesting moment again. Take a pause here and see what you would do as white. The idea here is that black wants to open the position on the queen side to create some play. And if white plays c3, I think there is a way to keep the game, let's say, on one-sided, like white is the one who's attacking, and this structure on the queen side can be somehow balanced. After b takes a2, white doesn't need to take the pawn, he doesn't have to take it, he can simply play king a1, and I think the game is interesting after this. Let's say if black plays something like a3, white could play something like b4, but it's not so easy to evaluate what could happen. There could be some possible sacrifices like this, but in a practical game, it's very hard to determine whether to go for such a dangerous idea. But I felt that this is an interesting try. In this position, after b3, Anand played c takes b3, and after a takes b3, he played a takes b3, and then after knight to f5, he decided to exchange with bishop takes f5, and after g takes f5, again a good moment to see what he would do as white. The move is pretty obvious to a natural attacker. It is to find the hook and go for it. So he plays pawn to g6, and after fg6, hg6, hg6, white finally achieves the queen rook battery with queen h2. Now queen h7 mate is threatened. Rook f7 is not possible because queen h8 is a mate. So the king has to run from g8 with king f7. And in this position, queen h7 is interesting, but here Anand played knight takes f5. Now this is actually a sacrifice that has some practical challenges, but objectively black can be better. So there is the puzzle that I gave you in the very beginning. What would you do as black? So Van Forest Jordan had a nice way to come back in the game and also pose a lot of threats. In this position, after knight takes f5, black had rook h8, an intermediate move attacking the queen. The point being that if you play something like queen g2, there is a thriller, bishop d3 check, and then let's say you also take rook takes bishop. Note that you can't play king a8 because of this check. So if you take rook takes c3, there is rook h1, and then there is queen c2 followed by a mate with rook a8. Of course, it's not so obvious, but after knight takes f5, this was the intermediate move that could have changed everything. If you play knight d6 check in this position, black has bishop d6, and then let's say you take e takes d6, there is again bishop d3 check. So this is a check which was hard to spot for Jordan. The idea being that if you take rook takes d3, there is rook h2, and then the rook on h1 is hanging. But after knight takes f5, he played e takes f5, and that gave a lot of initiative, throughout from here until the very end. Vishy never gave any chance to his opponent. He played queen h7, queen g6, and then played bishop c3, simply retaining the bishop, avoiding all kinds of checks. And then after queen g7, he played rook h6. After queen g6, rook g6, it's ensured that he will win the piece on f6, and he has many pawns up in the opposite colored bishop endgame. So he takes his time out, puts his pawn on b4, and then eventually takes on f6. Note that you can't take this because of rook d5. So black goes rook b7 and then king d2. This is a position that's winning. Even if the rooks are exchanged, white has pawns that's at least 2 files separated. So I mean to say that the pawn on b2 and the pawn on f6, there's a lot of distance between them, which makes it easy for white to win. So after a few moves, here if rook takes d1, king takes d1, what happens is that this king can go slowly to the queen side to assist the pawn on b5, and once this bishop is sacrificed, then you have another pawn to roll. This king and bishop together, they cannot coordinate with the b pawn because we also have the f pawn. So that's the reason why it is winning, and white won after a few moves. There is no problem at all. After rook e7 check, king d5, f7, there is also rook e8 coming, and in this moment Van Forest Jordan resigned. So I had great fun watching this game live. It was very exciting to see Vishy sir back in action after a really long time, and I'm very curious to see his remaining games. He's still playing right now. I think the game is going on against Nepomniachtchi. I'll be back with another video soon. Do like the video, Take care. Bye bye.